my name is Manmeet, and I'm an undergraduate here at Sac State in my last semester. I am a cell and molecular concentration in biology and a minor in dance. And I'm going to be talking about the journey through I-Corps that we had through the National Science Foundation. So the project that we started was on the autologous thrombin device, and Dr. Chapman and I have been working on this project for 3 years. And a little summary on what the project is what we're doing is there's an enzyme in our body called thrombin, and that usually is produced when we have a cut wound. And what we're trying to do is create this enzyme outside of the patient's body using their own blood, so that way we can enhance wound healing and regeneration of the wounded area. And our process is a safer alternative to what the current use is in bovine thrombin. So they're using cow's blood in order to produce the thrombin enzyme, and what we want to do is use the patient's own blood, so that way we can reduce the black box warning that's on the bovine thrombin, which from the FDA means that it could potentially harm us in terms of causing blood clots and factor deficiencies. And I'm going to show a little video on a little bit of the process for the thrombin device, so you can better understand a little bit on what the project is.
Our technology is based upon the discovery that it's possible to make a medical device that produces thrombin on demand. This is an important attribute because surgeons require thrombin to stop bleeding. The first step of our process is the activation of a device. Here, Mummy is injecting calcium chloride and plasma. This activates the coagulation cascade to produce thrombin. The device is allowed to incubate for 12 minutes on the bench. Now 12 minutes has elapsed, and we want to confirm the activation has occurred. We do that by inspecting the device, and we can see that the beads are plastered against the wall, showing us that activation has occurred. The activated device can be stored for 2 hours. The thrombin can be produced upon demand. Once the surgeon is ready for the thrombin, the next step is to add the reagents. Massive amounts of thrombin are produced. The procedure takes approximately 90 seconds to do. At this point is the harvest of the thrombin. The next step of our process is to add thrombin to the platelet-rich plasma. A gel is formed, which is a solid, and the physician can place this gel directly on a wound that needs accelerated healing.
We are very excited to bring this project from the lab bench to the marketplace. The safety improvement of our product will be very beneficial for patients that are in need of platelet gels.
All right, so I'm going to take you through my journey with NSF. And this starts with the interview process. So the first interview process we were given, the program usually requires the entrepreneurial lead to be a doctoral student or a master's student, and I was an undergrad. So when the interviewer asked me whether I'm a postdoc or a doctorate candidate or a master's student, I kept saying no. And he said, "Well, then what are you?" And I said, "I'm an undergraduate." And I remember there was dead silence on the phone, and it was a conference call as well for the interview. And they said that this is going to be a problem. And so through this first interview, I actually had to prove myself to be as well composed and mature, I guess. And they wanted to see that I'm really serious about this, because it does take a lot of effort and a lot of commitment to go through this process. And to be honest, at that time, I didn't really realize how much effort it really would have us go through. So I shrugged it and I was like, I can handle this. And then we got through the process, and it was definitely a roller coaster ride. And so the first interview, luckily, was a success, and we were able to go through the second interview process, which actually happened in between one of my meetings for my internship. So I had to step aside, and I remember I prepared really hard for this last interview. I had a bunch of papers printed out, highlighted with all the details of the project, and all laid out. So if one of the judges on the interview asked a question, I can refer to that specific page. And the very first question they asked is, in less than a minute, or in 30 seconds, describe your project and what you're trying to accomplish from it. And I was so lucky that I had the perfect slide that summarized it in such a short paragraph. And the primary focus of the interviews really was to see whether the entrepreneurial lead is actually leading the conversation. And I was really grateful that I stepped up, whether I knew the answer to like the questions that they asked or not. I tried to answer them to the best of my abilities before Dr. Chapman or Dr. Smith can comment on it, so that way they can see that I'm really interested in like trying to understand the project and go through this whole process. So after that second interview, we got an email in 20 minutes, and I definitely was scared because usually when you get quick responses like that, it's usually a denial, and it's like, sorry, you can't participate. But it was already an acceptance letter, and they said, congratulations, you've been selected, and that's when the journey began. So we were given several books for the course. So as entrepreneurs, if you're interested in reading some of the books by Steve Blank, many of these books were given to us through this program, the I-Core Teams program. And they really help to narrow down like what specifically we want to understand for this project. And the URL link at the bottom, if you go to that email or website, they actually have a lot of the videos that we were required to go through in the course in order to understand each of the processes in creating business model canvas, which I'll be showing in a little bit. So our first presentation at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, there were 7 evaluators. They're also known as the teaching team, who were there to not only critique the project, but also help us go through the process in figuring out whether our project is a need to have, a nice to have, or not very important. And so I ended up being the very first presenter out of all the teams that were present there, and they actually set me as an example for the rest. So 30 seconds into my speech, they shouted, "So what? Who cares? Why?" And I had to keep that composure as well as possible and answer the questions as well as I possibly can. And I remember after this presentation, my interviewer, his name is Ravindra Das Gupta, he actually stood up and applauded me for my composure and saying that he was very impressed by how well I was capable of answering all the questions without hesitation. And of course, I didn't answer it to the best of my abilities, but he was very impressed that I actually kept going on rather than freezing up on the stage. So that really gave me a lot of encouragement, especially after being grilled on the stage, to continue on and not feel so bad. So the very first value propositions and business canvas that we created was this. And just looking at it, it's a bunch of words, and you really wouldn't want to read any of it. And that's exactly the expression that we got from one of the judges, his expression literally was, whoa. Like, he literally had that reaction. And as soon as I looked at him and saw that, I already knew something's going to go on. And so the purpose of this whole business model canvas is really helps you to shape what your project is geared towards. So the value propositions are the most important aspect of the entire business model canvas. So we created a new business model canvas, and that is much more concise. And what we said for our value propositions were that the activity for the clotting reagent in our apparatus clots within 15 seconds, if not less. And the difficulty of creating the value proposition was that you really want to find something very valuable that if you compare it to another project that's similar to yours, you can say, okay, this is definitely something valuable. So, for example, if we said, before we put like specifically towards clot activity, we said that we're able to generate the thrombin in a much faster pace. And so that was kind of a weak proposition because a lot of different apparatuses that we use can be created in order to reduce the time it takes for production. So we had to really dig in to see how the shortening of the time that we have for our device can really benefit in the market. And from there, we had to look at customer relationships and customer segments. Who would really benefit? Which customers would actually buy our products? So we had to look at several different aspects. So we examined perfusionists in the United States and in Europe. We had to look at cardiovascular surgeons, cardiothoracic specifically, and orthopedic surgeons, especially for wound healing, since they're doing a lot of projects geared towards platelet-rich treatments, and oral surgeons as well. And so for our first round of interviews, we examined the comprehensive care services that had many perfusionists that we were capable of speaking to. And we learned a lot through them on like what their current processes are and how they're really evaluating what they're doing. And we did a lot of cold calls in the University of Michigan Health System, and we were able to get some interviews. Since cold calling is kind of tough, it took us a while. And that took us to our a VA hospital that we were a part of, and we actually got kicked out of it because of the cold calling. They didn't want us to do interviews since they're really tight about who comes in and who's present and who they're talking to. So that didn't turn out as planned. But we also went to Joseph Mercy Hospital, and we were definitely able to find a lot of interviews there that allowed us to help shape our second presentation that we had. And from the second presentation, we learned from all the interviews that our project isn't really as enthusiastic with the professionals that work in this field of surgeons. They already are so used to using bovine products that they didn't really see a significant need for our project. So because of that, we had to do a lot of background researches, find new markets, and discover where could our project possibly fit in. And that landed us in Europe. So I had the privilege to go to Amsterdam for my first set of interviews. Yeah, there's a little teacup on top of the hospital, which is interesting to me. But we did a lot of cold called interviews, and surprisingly, they were a lot more welcoming rather than the U.S. with the cold called interviews. They were much more difficult because there was a lot of private clinics there, but we were definitely able to get a lot of interviews in nonetheless. And of course, we did some sightseeing as well, so that was exciting. We also went to Belgium, and we've had several interviews in Belgium, especially at the hotel that I was staying at. There was a lot of individuals that I was able to contact through LinkedIn and finalize meeting dates with them via email so that way they can meet up. And one of the individuals that we met up with was Michael Hoofs, and he's the CEO of Avance Medical Groups, and he actually showed a lot of enthusiasm towards the project, and he was very excited and actually showed us that there is actually a market for us in Europe, and that especially since Europe is trying to eliminate all use of animal-based products, it opened up a much larger market for us because we're using patients' own blood, own tissue. So in other words, autologous operation in order for wound healing. And our last place that we interviewed was France, and we've received a lot of, by the end of the Europe trip, we were able to get 13 interviews, and I was able to get about 5 cold calls. So overall, the trip to France, to Europe was very successful in that we were able to find a lot of great information about the European market. And some of that is the CE marking for the device. It's much easier to get that approved in Europe, rather not as it's not as extremely regulated as it is in the USA with the FDA and all of that, and the clinical. And as mentioned before, they also don't want to use animal-based products. So they it encouraged us to look more into it and come to the U.S. to see whether we can actually find a market. And so through all the interviews that we've done, we actually found that oral surgeons are interested in finding more human-based products rather than using the animal-based products. So we were finally able to see a little light in the USA for our market. One thing I wanted to actually point out is, as an entrepreneur and as a new entry level, using LinkedIn as a resource was the best idea. So I literally, as you can tell by the graph right here, I had no viewers on my profile until I started doing more adding a lot of perfusionists on my account, a lot of cardiovascular surgeons, cardiothoracic surgeons, orthopedic surgeons. I kept adding more and more of them and emailing them, messaging them, posting on their own orthopedics pages, forums that they had, and by the end of the summer, I ended up becoming a somebody. Like, there was a lot of people that started viewing my profile and started adding me a lot. And that actually helped increase my credibility in a way. Because as an undergraduate with no experience, the more and more professionals that you actually have in your network, the more you're able to actually get noticed by others. So as a result, there's one orthopedic surgeon, Dr. I just blanked on his name. Stanford.
Oh, no.
So,
I'm blanking on his name too.
so one of the doctors that work at Stanford, he actually ended up calling me himself because he kept seeing my name all over his forum, his email. I even emailed his secretary personally to see if I can get an interview with him, and they actually never got back to me, but then eventually he called me randomly right after I brushed my teeth, too. It was perfect timing. And I ran downstairs to my office and, started digging through my backpack to find the questions that I wanted, because he was like, I have 10 minutes to answer any question you have. And I'm like, okay, asking the most important one on the list. So I got right into it and actually got a lot of great information out of him, even in the small 10 minutes that I had. And so for our final presentation, we started off with a storytelling. So we were required to make a video on our journey throughout the NSF I-Core Teams program, which interviews that we've conducted, where we ended up in our new market, our customer segment. And so we had a lot of work done in terms of the video production for our project. And then we also had, this is actually who Ravindra Das Gupta, the guy that interviewed us for the program, and he gave a lot of encouraging information about whether our project is a go or a no-go. You should definitely continue on to strive for what your project is about. The best thing that I learned through this whole process is that if you have a project, try to go out and speak about that project and see how others feel about it. What is your customers really looking for? And if you can shape your project, your product into what they specifically want, you'll have a much higher success rate in creating customer segments, finding the right companies that would buy the product and manufacture it as well. And this is our final presentation that we did. We had to stand up there and give our 10-minute speech on the product, the completion of the entire project. So in addition to the video that we produced, we had to create a presentation walking through all the teams that were there for the project. And at the end, the NSF I-Core Teams program gives out one award to one team member, team that really emphasizes the spirit of the NSF I-Core Teams program. And that ended up being us. And that was really shocking to me, actually. Thank you. I was really excited about this, but I honestly, when I was sitting there, I heard the team number, Team 324, but I was just sitting there. I didn't think about it being us. And Dr. Chapman turned around and said, "That's you, go up there." And I was like, oh. And so I was really, really excited, and I didn't have any words. I was kind of speechless, but it was really shocking to me because towards the end, the person that interviewed me on the phone himself, before he left after my presentation, said that he was really nervous about having me as an undergraduate participating in this program. But seeing how much I grew, how much maturity I had, and how well I was able to develop myself as a person, as an entrepreneur, and as a scientist, he was very impressed by all the work that I put in. And I think it was very encouraging for me to stand there amongst all the master's students and postdocs and surprising the audience by saying that I was an undergraduate. They definitely were shocked, but towards the end of the day, they were very, very welcoming and accepting of it. I thought that they might be a little uneasy about having an undergraduate, and they might look down upon me. So I never really mentioned that I was an undergraduate until my very last presentation. Only one group knew that I was an undergrad, and we actually helped each other a lot throughout the process in finding interviews because the realm of our study was very similar. So that was our journey through the NSF I-Corps Teams program. Thank you.
Just to add a little bit, as principal investigator, I was responsible for getting this process going in the spring of 2014. And as Manmeet mentioned, part of that process was telephone conference interviews from the teaching team, I believe in Ann Arbor at the time. They may have been all over the country. And when Manmeet said they asked what level of education she was at, she said undergraduate, and there was silence on the phone. The program director at NSF said, "This is very serious, Warren." Silence. And so he asked Manmeet, he said, "How do you address Dr. Smith?" And she said, "Well, when we're together doing our team activities, I call him Warren. And when we're more out in a general public situation, I call him Dr. Smith." And I think that's how we got accepted. Now, another thing that Manmeet made it maybe seem a little too easy. To me, it was a huge challenge. We were accepted and started this process with 23 other teams from around the United States in early summer, and went to Ann Arbor with everybody else. They gave us a very short few lectures and then said, "Get out of the building." That's why the title. We were required to, through the many weeks of the summer, accumulate 100 in-person interviews of potential customers. Well, how does that sound? 100. And we did the best we could. And so there we were in Ann Arbor. We'd flown in, got rental cars, etc. Get out of the building. How do you start interviewing you don't know the city? So John suggested, well, let's go over to the hospital and sit in the cafeteria. We'll find somebody who has a gown on, they've come out of surgery, we'll talk with them. And so that's a kind of creativity that we had to have in order to start getting interviews. How do you do it? But we did, and very worthwhile, but very demanding. Through that whole summer, we were doing cold calls, walking into offices that we'd never been in before, contacting people in any way we could to have these interviews. Anything more, John?
No, I think that was it. So we just thank you for your time today. He let us share our story and our journey with you, and that we wish you good journeys as well.
More so a statement. I want to say first and foremost, this is the first biotechnology lecture I actually benefited from and learned. It was usually over my head, and I got the glazed eyes and didn't quite really grasp it. So thank you very much. I really appreciated learning a little bit about Sacramento State and what we're contributing to the community, and I wish I knew more of it. I hope to learn more in the future, because what you folks are doing is amazing. And secondly, as a good capitalist, I can really appreciate the lecture points there about entrepreneurial spirit and everything else. And finally, heck, if I had known the travel involved in this kind of degree, I might have gone that direction.
That was actually uncalled for. One of the teaching team members, we actually had a video conference with him, and he suggested that several previous teams have actually gone out and actually flown into their required areas in order to seek more interviews. And for us, since it was Europe, we kind of laughed it off. It was like, oh, that's a great idea. We're not going. But then another teaching team actually, right before one of our webinar sessions, emailed a whole list of air flights from Sacramento that goes to London right after our call and said, you should think about getting on one of these flights and going there. And we looked at each other and we're like, are they really serious about this? So we planned a trip within a week to go to Europe and do all these interviews. One thing I wasn't aware of was, since this is academic, I required a president's signature. So 3 days before the flight, which should have been 30 days before the flight, I went to go get president approval along with the dean and the department chair. And that was a pretty crazy day, but I was pretty impressed by how I was able to get all those signatures in less than 24 hours.
You know,
Awesome.
I just want to add one thing. I met Mommy, like she said, 3 or 4 years ago. And when she came to my laboratory the first time, she was so shy. She was in the back. She wouldn't talk. And I saw her travel from there to here.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, very good.
Question? So the first one was, so what? And then,
So what? Who cares? That was the two that I remember.
and then another one was like,
It was that-
why?
And it was that loud and that intimidating. She was the first speaker. So it was like, thrombin converts fibrinogen to fibrin. And it just, the first few words out of her mouth, said, so what? You know, wow. It was like intimidating as it could be. And bless Mommy's heart, she didn't flinch. She stood her ground and just answered the question, so what? I'll tell you so what. And I didn't know she had it in her. You know, I didn't.
Another comment, the CSU opportunity for participating in I-Corps at that level, teams that do well become eligible to apply to the national I-Corps process. So that's something to keep in mind too.
Are we
Any other
adjourned?
questions?